I'm Adam Weinberg, the Alice Pratt Brown Director of the Whitney Museum of American Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here this evening to the 17th Walter Annenberg Lecture. The Annenberg Lecture features a distinguished artist who has made a significant contribution to American art and culture. Previous speakers presented in the series include Klaus Oldenburg, Hiroshi Sugimoto, Sarah Z., Carol Walker, Jason Moran, and Julie Meritu. The Annenberg Lecture Series was created in 2003 in honor of Ambassador Walter H. Annenberg by the late Stephen Ames, our beloved trustee. And I would particularly like to acknowledge this evening Gregory Annenberg Weingarten, who couldn't be here with us this evening, for his great support of our program over the years through his philanthropic initiative, Grow at Annenberg, which is part of the Annenberg Foundation. And I'd like to thank the Annenberg family members, Regina and Zoe Weingarten, and Stephen Ann's wonderful wife and active member at the Whitney, Ann Ames, as well as Liz Kabler. Thank you so much for your tremendous support of the Whitney. Tonight's lecture is the second Annenberg Lecture this year, indeed, following the postponement of the lecture series in 2020 due to COVID-19. I want to acknowledge this evening the profound difficulties the world has had and continues to face as the resilience that artists, museums, and our audiences have shown. What could be a more fitting way to celebrate community than a conversation with Dawoud Bey, who has thought deeply and brilliantly and revealed varying notions of community in his art. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and for engaging and supporting the arts at the Whitney. It is my great pleasure tonight to introduce Dawoud Bey this evening as our honored artist for the program. He's a photographer whose work expands and redefines the American narrative. Dawoud Bey began his career framing Harlem in transition during the post-civil rights era of the 1960s. Underpinning his now almost 5 decades-long career is a remarkable empathy and enduring commitment to picturing under- or misrepresented communities in history. Behind his rich and psychologically compelling photographs, Bey generously shares narratives we have seen and the way African Americans have too often been seen through and all too often ignored by the lens of American photography. As Dawoud has written, Black people have been killed for directing their gaze at the wrong person. I want my subjects to reclaim their right to look, to see, and be seen. From street portraits taken with a 35mm camera to 20 by 24 Polaroid portraiture to landscapes, Bey's conceptual, material, and formal evolutions attest to a singular vision in channeling the complexity and humanity of his subject. Giving palpable presence and voice to the disenfranchised, to adolescents, to outsiders, to victims of racism and slavery who can no longer speak for themselves. Bey's work restores memory and reimagines history. Through his innovative interrogation of historical, social, and political relationships, we are able to reconfigure America's past, see the possibilities of the present, and posit new hopes for the future. The current exhibition, of which we are very proud here at the Whitney Museum, is Dawoud Bey, An American Project, and it is the foremost example of the Whitney's long engagement with the artist's work. I want to gratefully acknowledge Corey Keller, curator at this, former curator at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and her own Elizabeth Sherman, who co-curated this show, which is still on view till October 4th. So for those of you who have not had a chance to see it, you still have time. Dawoud has appeared in 10 Whitney exhibitions in the last 25 years, including 2 biennials. And in fact, the Birmingham Project was an excerpt of that, which we'll be talking about tonight, was shown in the 2014 biennial. We also have a great collection of Dawoud's work in the Whitney Museum. Dawoud has shown his work in exhibitions worldwide, from the Art Institute and the Barbican, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Barbican in London, the Los Angeles County Museum, the High Museum in Atlanta, the National Portrait Gallery in London, and many, many others. He has received many deserved awards. He's not going to get a chance to speak tonight. I'm going to do this whole thing. Notably, a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship in 2017, a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. Bey is currently Professor of Art and a former Distinguished College Artist at Columbia College Chicago, one of the great photography schools in America. Dawoud has also spoken extensively about his work in many different contexts and venues in the past. So tonight, we decided on a thematic approach rather than marching through a chronology. So drawing on Dawoud's longstanding preoccupations in his practice, we've identified 4 themes. The first one is community and context, the second, portraiture, the third, history and memory, and the final, display as discourse. Please join me in welcoming Dawoud Bey.
Thank you very much for that beautiful introduction, Adam.
Well,
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here, and I love having your photographs here, and I love having you here regularly. And it's great because Dawoud is also here in New York because he's opening a wonderful show, which I hope many people will see at the Sean Kelly Gallery of Recent Work, which we'll talk about shortly. So I'm going to start off with community and context. What for you does it mean? What does community mean? Do you have to be living in the community? Do you have to be from the community? Is it enough to be just a resident or somebody passing through?
Well, I think for me, community has many different meanings, many different implications, beginning with perhaps the community that I came out of. The community that was initially my community of support as an artist here in New York. That community was primarily a community that began to take shape through the various what were then called alternative institutions in New York. Institutions like Studio Museum in Harlem, which is certainly central to the formation of my community of both friends and artists, along with the Cinque Gallery, Exit Art, Midtown Y, Photography Gallery, 4th Street Photo Gallery. I mean, there were a number of institutions beginning in the 1970s that were absolutely crucial to the formation of what has become my community. So there's that way of thinking about community for me in the immediate sense. I'm also, as we were talking about earlier before we began, a product of that generation that came of age in the late 60s and early 70s, and at a very tumultuous time in American history. And that moment and those years in which I was very much engaged in various forms of social activism is probably what has most grounded me in the notion of community. You know, being mindful of community and being responsive to the needs of community, even as I've continued to develop the thinking about my work.
So when you started making the Harlem USA photographs, when did you decide that the project was going to be called Harlem USA? Did you just start photographing in Harlem as part of your residency at the Studio Museum, and then you realized there was a body of work coming and that you were defining the community? Or did you set out to say, I want to do a body of work on Harlem?
Both, and the initial impetus was actually even more personal than that. My mother and father met in Harlem. So that community is, I guess you could say, central to my own narrative. Since if my mother and father hadn't met in Harlem, I mean, among many other things, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. So that was the initial motivation for that work, was to reconnect to a community that I not only had a very real familial connection to, but a community that had been represented in very essentialist and somewhat stereotypical ways within popular media, which at the same time was also, at a moment that became known as the Harlem Renaissance, a real center, an important center of Black expressive culture. So I was aware of the totality of Harlem as a place, as a place of great significance to African American socio-political and expressive culture. So there was that foundation. There was the experience of going to see the Harlem on My Mind exhibition when I was 16 years old, during that tumultuous moment that I was speaking about. And people were speaking back to the Met as an institutional space around the various problematics of that exhibition. So all of those things are part of the foundational set of reasons that when I decided to begin my first project, I decided, as a consequence of personal history, influenced by the experience of Harlem on my mind, being the very first museum exhibition that I had ever seen on my own, I decided that I would contribute something to the visualization and the conversation about that community. And the reason for calling it Harlem USA is kind of like the American story here. It's an American story. Harlem USA. It exists in this country. It's not a place aside or a place separate from. This is Harlem USA. You know, so I wanted that to be kind of explicit in the titling of the work. And it was also important to me, speaking about community, that the community in which I had made that work would be also the community in which that work would first be seen through the Studio Museum in Harlem. I wanted to make work in a community and then make that work available and accessible to the community in which I had made the work. So that was the first time that I began to consciously think about the relationship of the work and where one situates or cites that work, and how an institution, in this case, Studio Museum in Harlem, might become a part of that conversation. And pretty much all of the work that I've done since then with institutions and communities and making work in communities and bringing museums into that conversation goes back to that first exhibition.
It's sort of a three-way. It's sort of a three-way relationship between you, an institution, a museum, or a school, and the setting of where you are. I think maybe we have a couple of images of Vanderzee here. I mean, are these the kinds of things that you were aware of when you went to the Met? And was Vanderzee?
Certainly, the photographs that are on the screen right now are two of the photographs that I saw when I went.
Oh, really?
These are two photographs that I saw, photographed by James Vanderzee. And I came away from the Met. If I remembered any photographer from that exhibition, it was James Vanderzee. There were others. I don't even remember exactly who, but I very explicitly remembered the work of James Vanderzee.
And is it because of the quality of the work? Because of the way that he also just focused in such depth?
Something about the elegant formality of the photograph and the subjects themselves. The fact that in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, through people coming to his studio, Van der Zee was constructing in these photographs an image of African Americans that ran directly contrary to how African Americans were being depicted, certainly in popular media of that time. But it was also the beautiful formality, the elegance of the photographs, the form of them, the composition of them, and the way the people in the photograph comported themselves for the camera. So I came away with a singular kind of memory from the Harlem on My Mind exhibition, and that would have been James Van der Zee.
You know, another, I know, influence for you, we had the wonderful Kamoinge exhibition here at the Whitney, and I know that you've often mentioned Louis Draper and Sean Walker, two of the members of that group. And what about them also kind of connected you to the idea of community and thinking about community?
Well, they made tangible the idea that there was such a thing as a black photographer. Before then, it was just an idea for me. I think the existence of Kamoinge, and I became very good friends eventually with most of the members. These two, Sean and Lou Draper, in particular, started out as mentors who became friends. But it was largely the fact that they existed, and that there was a group of black photographers who were not making work for magazines, who were not making work for newspapers. They were making photographs as an expressive act. Because it never occurred to me to want to work for newspapers, or that wasn't my idea.
So that's when
Probably because even though James Van der Zee was making photographs basically of whoever walked through his door, I was probably most taken with the fact that I encountered those pictures in a museum. Not in a magazine, I saw them on the wall in a museum. So that became for me the aspirational space. Like, where do I want my work to end up? So it was this idea of being an artist with a camera and making pictures as an expressive act. I became very close. Lou Draper is no longer alive, but Lou took a particular interest in my work. I spent a lot of time at Sean Walker's studio. But it was really about beginning a conversation with a generation of black photographers. They were all more or less a generation ahead of me, but they made real and tangible the thing that up to that point I had only imagined.
So it's the idea of also lineage and the idea of connecting to generations of community, that not just the community you're in, but the community that preceded you.
Yeah, and I first encountered both of their works in the Black Photographers Annual.
Yeah, which were great.
That's where I saw their work, and that's what made me aware of them. And being in New York, and again, speaking about the role of institutions as places where people congregate and community are formed. If you hang out in the same place long enough, you would begin relationships, and that's pretty much how I began. But I think are absolutely important relationships with both of them, along with Tony Barboza, Jimmy Manis, also from Kamoinge. I won't go into the names because I became very good friends pretty much with a few exceptions, with almost all of them.
So if we go on to the next images, I mean, and we have some, more from Harlem USA, but it's interesting. And you go back and do Harlem Redux, and I think it's 2014. Here's an example. This is almost 30-something year difference. How does this address community? I mean, here,
40-something years,
oh
actually.
God, sorry, not too good at math, or maybe I'm trying to diminish the time, but.
Yeah, I don't mind. I'm as old as I am.
But
I don't shy away from it.
so how did Harlem change as a community for you during that time?
Well, certainly after the initial group of photographs in Harlem, I continued to spend time in the Harlem community. Not solely because of Studio Museum in Harlem being there, but certainly whenever I was in Harlem. Studio Museum in Harlem is an institution that I've been in almost a constant ongoing relationship with for the last 40-something years. It's kind of the center still of my community. But during those years of continuing to visit Harlem, it was apparent that the community was going through a continuing evolution, and that the social and the physical landscape of the community was changing, largely through influx of global capital and through forces of gentrification. And that community was being transformed in significant ways. And I wanted to make some work about that, the way in which the shape of that community was changing as it was happening.
Was there a sense of loss at that point, or did you feel that there was some sense of loss from the community because it had so gentrified?
Absolutely, because there were any number of places that I came to refer to. I mean, you can look here. I mean, there were parts of Harlem, certainly at the height of that, and it's still going on, that were construction sites, or as I referred to them, spaces where something used to be.
So
and when something disappears,
so absence. It was a lot about absence.
There's a real absence, and there's a disruption of place memory for those who have lived in the community. But there's this restructuring of space that really constitutes an erasure of memory. Major cultural landmarks like Lenox Lounge get replaced by, some anonymous corporate entity of a building. And I wanted to make work about that, not the aftermath, but as it was taking place, to kind of insert myself into that. But then, of course, the work became significant to me also because it was the first time that the human subject, the portrait, was not the focus, conceptual anchor to the work. It was about not the narrative of the human subject, but the narrative of place, how to talk about and visualize and conceptualize a visual and photographic language to talk about place. So this work certainly marked a significant shift in my work.
Absolutely.
Probably the first real significant shift since Harlem USA.
So when you've talked to me in the past about people like Walker Evans or Mike This Farmer as both having been, kind of also some precedents for your work. Could you say a word?
Walker Evans is, for those who know his work, one of the most important American photographers. One of those photographers who began to create the photographic language for visualizing the American social, and physical landscape. And Evans's contribution also had to do with what constituted meaningful subject matter for a photograph. Evans began to shift the hierarchy of subject matter in terms of what was worthy of being photographed. what was worthy of being paid attention to. Walker Evans, who became known, I think, probably mostly for the work that he did during the Depression era as a photographer for the Farm Security Administration. And there's something very instructive about Evans that is not often talked about. Because when he was making the Farm Security Administration work, he was working with the writer and the economist, James Agee. And they had a conversation, a kind of quiet argument, because James Agee believed that in order to gather the information that he needed to speak about the lives of these now dispossessed migrant farmers and their families, that he had to live with them.
That's right. That's right.
And Walker was like, well, Jim, you can do that. But I'm
not doing it.
I'm not going to be getting bitten by bed bugs.
Well,
I don't need to be bitten by bed bugs in order to make the work. I'll be in the hotel in town, and I will come back and see you in the morning, and we'll continue the work. And that's a fundamental debate about
correct.
a certain form of documentary work.
Right.
How close, in fact, does one need to be to the subject
Perfect.
in order to make meaningful work? Agee believed you had to live with them.
Right.
Evans believed that he could go away, get a good night's sleep, come back with your eyes and your mind wide open,
Exactly.
and make the work. I'm with Evans.
Okay. Now, I'm going to skip ahead a little to the pictures. You had a wonderful series called Strangers and Community that you did in 2010. And to me, this is like absolutely brilliant because, if you didn't know the title, you'd have a hard time knowing, what is the connection? And actually, it talks exactly to what you're talking about, Agee and Evans. What does it mean to know somebody? What does it mean to be part of a community? What does it mean to be a stranger? Can you say a few words about this series?
Yeah, and this work really, it's a project that I worked on
It's incredible.
Intermittently for several years. And I wanted to, first of all, interrogate this notion of community. People speak about community as if it is a singular entity.
Right.
Even though community is a very particular kind of social construct.
Exactly.
There are people who live in communities who never know each other, not by accident, but by design. And I wanted to engage this notion of bringing two people together from a community and having them sit together in a kind of common witness and to meet each other at the moment that I'm making the photograph.
And you're the one who unites them. I mean, because the only reason they're there is because of you.
They're there because of me, even though they're from the same community.
Right.
They've never encountered each other.
Right.
It might have been they were people who worked in a service capacity in a university cafeteria, and there were people on faculty and administration. They never engaged until they sat in front of my camera for this idea, Strangers Community. So I wanted to take on that idea that community is indeed a complex kind of social construct.
Did you pose them?
Yes and no. Yes and no, because in all of the portrait-based work that I've done over the years, the initial gesture has to come from the person, and then I shape that to the rectangular space of the picture. If they're doing this and it's hitting the edge of the frame, I won't tell them, don't do that. I'll just say, bring your arms in slightly. So the gesture is still there. And then I shape that for the purpose of making the photograph. You know, in order for the portrait to have a level of psychological credibility, it has to come from the person. And then in a very even-handed way, I shape that to the picture-making experience. I tend to observe people before I'm making the photograph of them, because the most interesting things that people do, you can't really direct them. You know, if you look at someone, if I look at the way that hand is suspended, I wouldn't think to do it.
Right.
You know, that's your behavior, and everyone has their own idiosyncratic gestural behavior. And I try to take mental notes about that and then bring that into the photograph.
Well, this is a perfect transition to the next category, which we call portraiture. Brilliant. But starting in the late '80s, you started working with a 4x5 camera. Which is not a handheld camera. You have a tripod, you're setting up. There's no accident in the sense of people know that you're taking the picture. Can you talk a little bit about that shift to 4x5 and how it changed your relationship with your subjects?
It changed the relationship with the subjects, and it changed the kinds of photographs I made. It changed materially and optically what the photographs look like. A large format camera and lens, just the material and the optical description of whatever the scene is very different from the appearance of a photograph made with a small camera.
Yeah, it feels more intensified in a way, not just the level of detail, but the engagement.
It's more richly, materially, and the way I describe it is that the air wraps around the subject in a different way. You can almost perceptibly see the air wrapping around the subject. There's a dimensionality to it if you take full advantage of the optics. But for me, the use of the camera, the 4x5 camera on a tripod, specifically with Polaroid material, which is also important to the street portrait work, had to do with questioning in some way the ethics of a certain kind of small camera picture making in which the subject is not actively engaged or, in some cases, even actively aware that they're being photographed. And I decided I wanted to have a more direct relationship.
I was going to say, is it a more equal footing with the subject? Because when you're working with a handheld camera, their awareness level is not the same degree as when you plant a tripod.
Yeah, the hierarchy of small camera picture making tends to always favor the photographer, not the subject.
That's a great line.
Yeah, and with the 4x5 camera, because it's a very, especially when you put it on a tripod, it becomes that much more deliberate as well as reciprocal, because the subject has to consent.
Exactly.
To being a part of the portrait project.
And do you ask them? You obviously go up and ask them.
I just ask them, you look interesting. Do you mind if I make a picture with you? And as I ask them, I'm kind of setting up the camera. I'm kind of already doing it.
So you're saying you don't take no for an answer?
It's a very subtle but direct kind of action. I'm asking and I'm doing it at the same time. And they would ask me, well, what am I going to get? And I said, well, actually, in 30 seconds, I'll have a print for you, and I'm going to give it to you. How much is it going to cost? It's not going to cost anything. That's not what I'm doing. I'm just making photographs in this community. And certainly the Polaroid, having that positive, negative Polaroid film and being able to give the subject a print and to make it a more dialogical and reciprocal process is a good part of the reason that they consented to being photographed. So I wanted to both shift the picture-making aspect materially, and I also wanted to shift the nature of the relationship between myself and the people that I was photographing.
How do you get them to relax in front of the camera? I mean, do you find that they get so self-conscious that, I mean, you know, it's interesting because you're obviously moving more slowly than you are with a handheld camera, but yet the people feel very comfortable. Is it just you and the way your presence, or what?
It's a hard thing to describe, Adam. I intrude in an absolutely unobtrusive way. If that makes any sense. Yes,
it makes actually total sense. Yes.
You know, I try to make that engagement seem absolutely natural, relaxed. I'm not heavy-handed in my approach. I approach it very casually, even though I had this big thing on a tripod. It's the most unnatural thing in the world to encounter when you're out in the streets minding your own business. But I just tried to make it seem like a very natural thing. And I was going to give you something in return for your participation. It's hard for me to describe, but
it's a very kind of human.
There's psychology involved, obviously.
Yeah, tremendously.
You know, controlling that space and that moment and drawing them into it in a way that's not intimidating.
Yeah.
I don't know how to describe it other than to say that it's something that I was very good at.
And you're not telling us your secret. It's like or the secret recipe that we'll never find out.
Because I don't know what the secret is, other than to treat people respectfully, quite frankly. Just treat them respectfully, no hidden agenda. I'm making pictures, I'm going to give you one, and they'll say, what you going to do with it? I said, maybe it'll be in the book, maybe it'll be shown, maybe not. At this moment, I don't know, but they do go out in public. So and I did have one person object to that. And of all the pictures I made, I had one person who objected to the idea that this was not just a private act, that it was going to have some kind of public iteration.
And did he or she decide not to do it, or?
It was a man who had 2 wives. I think his reason.
We'll go to the next topic. So you started.
One was in North Carolina or somewhere. The other was in Brooklyn, and he just didn't want any public pictures of himself.
Be careful! This is all being recorded.
Yeah, he didn't. He didn't want a picture of himself being identified
with
as
the wrong wife. Exactly. So,
so his reasons were very different, but that was the only one.
Yeah. So you started working with the 20 by 24 camera, which, as you can, not only is they're a big camera, you also have another operator involved. It's called 20 by 24 because that's the size of the prints that you get from it. And
the camera itself is 265 pounds.
And you go to it. It doesn't come to you for the most part, right? You go to it. It doesn't come to you.
Yeah. Yeah, the subject has to come to where the camera is, which is something I was always trying to figure out, which I ultimately did when I worked in Atlanta, and I was able to put the camera in a school where the students were, to actually take the camera to the subjects, you know, which had something to do with the lingering aspects of worlds in a small room.
Yes,
to take the studio to the subject. There's some of that.
There you go.
You know.
There you go.
Yeah, because Penn was was someone whose work I came to very early on, along with these photographs and the photographs that he made. I think we have some from Small Trades. And I was really taken by this idea of bringing people from their everyday lives into a space of heightened consideration. You know, the studio. I encountered this work very early on when I started photographing, probably 1976, 1977. Penn had a show of small trade works at Marlborough, and then Richard Avedon had an exhibition at Marlborough around that same time that I saw. And this idea of the subjects being taken out of the natural world and placed in the context and the environment of the studio, and how one could use that space to create an even more heightened psychological experience of the individual was something that became a part of my, I guess, store bank of knowledge very early on that I didn't actually use until much later.
But they were both working within the realm of fashion. If we go to look at a few of your Polaroids, I mean, these are also taken out of the context. They're also very stylized. But do they really have to do with fashion in the same way that either Avedon?
You know, I think both Avedon and Penn worked in fashion, but they also had and made substantial work outside of that, even though we tend to think of the studio as a kind of, you know, highly stylized space of the making of a certain kind of commercial photograph. You know, I think part of their genius was that they didn't always make those kinds of photographs in that space. Like Worlds, you know, Worlds in a small room, and particular small trades, you know, there's nothing glamorous about the photograph, other than our notion of what usually takes place in a studio with artificial lights. So for me, it was more about creating a space where the attention was focused solely on the subject. My interest, I don't know if we have a single image, but my initial motivation when I started working in the studio with the 20 by 24 Polaroid camera, the initial inspiration was the paintings of Rembrandt. I had to write a report on Rembrandt when I was in the 6th grade and fell in love with the work and fell in love with the heightened sense of the individual within that space, the warm brown background of the space, the single light source. You know, that all came initially from Weinberg. And then as I was pinning the photographs up, the individual photograph, I asked myself, why am I making a decision, which is the usual decision a photographer makes. You make multiple photographs, multiple exposures, and then you decide which one is the one that best exemplifies that situation. And I decided I actually like both of them, and something more complex came out of keeping those two photographs together.
So you don't really see then the photographs that you make outside or in the street as being that really, in terms of artifice, being all that different from what you're doing in the studio. I mean, they're not, I mean, they're different, but they're not.
Yeah, the aspect of directing is certainly common to both of them. I think the difference has to do with, it's a contextual difference because place also has its own narrative. You know, this is this person in this place, so therefore this person must be X because they're standing in this place. When we eliminate, you know, the narrative of space and place, that same individual is free to exist in a very different kind of space. And I wanted to play around with that space, a space that wasn't driven by the social or the geographic context of place, but to just look more resolutely at the individual and to work out my ideas about the portrait, free of the narrative of place being attached to it.
So let's go to our next section on history and memory, because that's really about place too. And and I think we have a few photographs here from the Birmingham Project. And talking about place, talk a little bit about place here, because in a way, place is what unites the subjects, even though it's not neutral in the same way.
Well, and obviously in this work, place is very significant.
Exactly.
Yet the idea of the diptych format came out of working in the Portraiture studio.
Right.
So that's a piece of the work that I'm able to bring forward in a very different context.
Right.
So that Polaroid work freed me from the notion that the photograph, had to exist as a single moment.
Yeah.
It kind of once and for all liberated me from that notion, which then makes this work possible in a very different context. This work came out of, I guess, what you could call a kind of unexpected epiphany. When one morning I had a very strong recollection of a photograph that I'd seen in a book called The Movement. And it was a picture not of one of the 4 girls who had been killed in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church that September morning in 1963, but the surviving older sister of one of the girls. One of the girls who had been killed was Addie Mae Collins. And this was a picture that I saw in this book called The Movement of her sister, Addie Mae Collins, lying in a hospital bed with her eyes covered by gauze bandages. And I saw that book in 1964 when my parents brought it home. So I would have been 11 years old. And that book, that picture just shook me to the core. Yeah. I never forgot it, even though I was able to eventually kind of park it somewhere. And one morning it came rushing back. It was that picture. And so I decided that I needed to do something with that. So I went to Birmingham, trying to figure out how to make work that was, I guess, adequate to the weight of that historical trauma. I spent quite a number of years going back and forth to Birmingham. I spent a lot of time in the community, letting people in the community get to know me, which has been kind of central to all of the work that I've made in different communities.
And the older person is the age that the person who...
the conceptual shape of this work is that the subject, the young person, is the same age as one of the 6 young African Americans killed that Sunday morning. The 4 girls and 2 African American boys who were killed in the violent aftermath. And the adult subject is the age that they would have been had they not been murdered that day. And then putting the 2 of them together, each diptych piece embodies the 50-year age difference and the 50 years time between 1963 and the year 2012. When I was making this work. So this work, while it's portraits and while it engages the diptych format, engages the idea of creating, I guess, what you could call this kind of liminal space in between the past and the present. Like, we know these are not the young people, but it has the emotional weight such that it
even the
be,
dividing line suggests that as well.
The dividing line of time.
Time, exactly.
So this is the first time that I really begin to think about and make work about history in a very specific and intentional way. even though you could say when I was in Harlem, that was there too, because I was there because of my family's history.
Right.
You know,
But that was more in the background. This is
exactly.
really in the foreground.
Yeah, this is
for
more
you.
explicitly
Yeah.
about making work, about history. How does one make work in the contemporary moment that's about to pass? And it's also the moment in which I go back to working with black and white material, because black and white is the material of photography's past, of photography's history. And I do want the work to materially allude to the history that I'm referencing in making the work.
You know, I'm always struck. I mean, obviously, there's the setting, there's the pose, but the thing that I'm most drawn by is the intentness of the gaze, the way that each one of the people is looking at you, looking at us. And was that something that you really, were striving to do, is to get them to look you right into the lens that way?
Absolutely. Because I think in most of my portraits, including the street portrait work, I do want the subject of the photograph to engage that hypothetical viewer that will ultimately be standing in front of the photograph. You know, when I make the work, for a long time now, I've made my work in order for it to exist in very specific contexts, like this, the museum or the gallery context. But what's always, I think, interesting about the gaze in relation to the portrait is that even as someone stands in front of them and they are looking at them, at the time I'm making the photograph, they're not looking at me.
Right.
They're looking at the lens.
Right.
Because if they were looking at me, it would be kind of, they would be looking off into space somewhere. So it's really about directing their quality of engagement with the camera, with the lens, while at the same time giving the appearance that the camera and all of the apparatus of the making of the work has kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
Because I certainly don't want you to think about any of that as you look at the work.
Yeah, because when they're looking at you, they're looking right through you. It's a confrontation.
Yeah, they're looking at us.
Yes.
You know, they're kind of
absolutely
collectively looking at us. And it was interesting because when I was making the work, certainly the adults in the photographs from the Birmingham Project all remember that day. Yeah. Most of them remember hearing the explosion go off. But all of the young people that I asked, they were all acutely aware of that history as well. I wasn't sure if that was going to be the case, but it was.
It's the photographs are so intense because if somebody's staring at you, the temptation is to look away. And here, when you're looking right at them. And even that, I find, even with the photographs, I find that I want to look away even from the photographs.
It's a kind of implicative gaze, almost like you're being implicated in something.
Right. Exactly. I want to show just a little piece of the video that you did in Birmingham because, this is about history and it's about memory. There's no gaze and there's no people.
That morning that was described as a bright blue Sunday morning before the explosion went off.
What made you want to do not just do a video, but here it was so much about, as we were just talking, the gaze, and then all of a sudden the people are gone. What was the impetus for this? What were you thinking?
After completing the portraits, the diptych portraits for the Birmingham Project, I wanted to explore yet another conceptual, narrative, and material way of engaging with that history. I had made one video work prior to that, along with the class pictures, photographs, a piece called Four Story. And there's four young people telling their stories without their faces being fully revealed. I've been something, I think, of a closet filmmaker for a while. I took film every semester that I was in grad school, studying with Michael Romer, who made this really important film, Nothing But a Man, with Ivan Dixon and Abby Lincoln. And I've always wanted to continue to explore the idea of history through the moving image, to make something, again, that evokes the past in an even more visceral and immediate material way. Each of the four spaces in 9/15/63, this video is meant to exemplify four different social spaces within Birmingham on the morning of the dynamiting. Two being two black social spaces, the barber shop and the beauty parlor, and then the segregated lunch counter and the classroom.
Right.
So I've had a long-standing interest in the moving image, and it's something that each time I've completed a project recently, I've wanted to return to the idea in a different way, using film.
Well, let's go to the next series, Night Coming Tenderly, because this is not obviously this is one of the more recent series, and this one also, like the film though, there's implied portraiture. There's a presence, but the presence is here through absence, which is also true in the film. But now you shifted to what normally used to be called landscape, but I don't know.
Think when people have told me that the figure has disappeared from this work, I usually respond by saying that the figure hasn't disappeared. They've just moved from here to here. Because when I was making this work, the choice of vantage point was to make the work as if through the eyes of an enslaved, escaping African American, moving through the landscape, to visualize their fugitivity through, this idea of them moving through the landscape on the way, in this case, to Lake Erie, and then on to Canada. So.
And are these all actual sites on the Underground Railroad, or are they proximate sites?
Some of them, like this one, Cozad Bates is pretty much one of the only known Underground Railroad sites in all of Cleveland. The others were made outside of Cleveland, in an area that was a very well-known site. John Brown lived there. There were a number of abolitionists in that area, and it's outside of Cleveland. The Underground Railroad, the exact path of it, had to remain unknown for obvious reasons. They were moving under cover of darkness through this landscape undetected. So some of them are actual sites. I would say a few of them are actual sites. This one, the others are imagined sites in proximity to known sites.
Right.
Because if the so-called Underground Railroad station in which fugitive enslaved people would take, temporary refuge, if it was over there, it stands to reason that they must have passed by over here.
Right, right.
So it was, for me, a question of proximity, examining and imagining the landscape around certain known points and trying to look at those pieces of the landscape as if, without knowing. But it wasn't just as if from the standpoint of making an interestingly shaped picture, but it was really trying to visualize the terrain through the eyes of a fugitive enslaved person moving through and encountering that unfamiliar terrain.
It's interesting.
So for me, they were always present.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when you were talking about the idea of moving to a large-scale camera and feeling the air envelop you, the scale of these photographs, what I always feel is that the photograph is enveloping me. You imagine yourself at night in these empty places and what it would be to not really know where you're going or who's in the house or what that would be. I mean, and there is something about both the combination of the scale and the darkness that envelops you.
Yeah, and scale is very important to this work because I did want them to move from a kind of object experience to one that was more experienced.
Absolutely.
In which the photograph kind of wrapped itself almost around you, which a smaller object doesn't do. Right. You're constantly aware that you're looking at a smaller object. The scale itself kind of allows you to become immersed in the thing that you're looking at. So scale is definitely very much a part of the object experience, the material experience of this work.
Yeah, and for me, they really are portraits in absentia. They are witnesses to something where the witnesses are no longer there, and that we're there to witness their absence. And I think that that's what's so brilliant about this and so moving about it. You really feel the sense of loss in this.
This work comes, I would not have been able to make this work without first having made Harlem Redux, which allowed me to begin to visualize the narrative of place. So this work comes out of Harlem Redux and also conceptually out of the Birmingham Project. Right. Those two things are what makes this work possible, to photograph in the contemporary moment while making something that alludes to the past, which is the Birmingham work. So,
well, it's always so interesting because in retrospect, it seems obvious how this got to this, but you realize as you're going one step ahead, it's like walking through the darkness. You don't really know where you're going, and it's only after the fact that you say, oh, if I hadn't done Redux, I couldn't have done this. If I hadn't made the video, I couldn't have done this. If I hadn't done something, it's great.
Yeah, because the work is always, for me, the work is in conversation with itself in terms of what I'm taking from each project and how that then sets up the possibility for whatever the next work might be through my, I guess, ongoing expansion of my own vocabulary, whether it's formally or materially.
Yeah,
and this work, which has the appearance of moving undercover
we have
of
that
darkness,
picture
I don't want to be
when I saw this picture up here, And I realized these are all the pictures are taken in daylight.
That's what it looked like.
I know. So the act of
But that's not the idea. So while I'm standing there, what I'm thinking about is what you see in those photographs. I'm not even thinking about this. I'm thinking about how this is going to translate into the thing that I'm in the process of making. So the work is always, for me, about the visualization of an idea. I don't document things. I'm making things that visualize a particular idea that I have about something, and then I have to use the material of the medium in order to realize that.
I think it's
it's kind of interesting because this is the fact, and then the work is the idea.
I think it's so brilliant because not only are you having to go from color, the world, to black and white, you're having to go from day to night. So the transformations you're making in your head intuitively, I mean, you're not thinking, oh, it's night, oh, it's black and white. You're giving yourself over to the whole process in your head. And
because even though I'm standing there, it kind of startled me to see it because that's not what I was thinking.
I'll tell you, when I first saw this, I went, oh my.
Me too, because that's not what I was thinking. That's not what I was making. That's a necessary part of the process on the way to making a very particular thing.
So why don't we go to just look a few, and then we'll move to the next topic. I just wanted to share a couple of these photographs. I mean, here's the total emptiness and pretty abstract, and and I think of de Carava and and the notion of darkness. He was a huge influence, I know, on your work and one of the great photographers of the 20th century. And I wonder if you share a little bit of, I mean, nobody has done more with black and dark gray than de Carava. I mean, one of the greatest.
Though Night Coming Tenderly Black is, in a sense, all about Lord de Carava.
Right.
All about his use of blackness as subject, blackness as narrative, and material blackness.
Right.
That describes his work, and it also describes Night Coming Tenderly Black, because the narrative is about black fugitivity. The materiality comes directly out of a conversation with Roy de Carava materially. So Roy de Carava's work has been very foundational to my thinking as an African-American photographer and artist who used the material of photography, not in a way that reinscribed what one sees, but to actually use the material as a way of interpreting what one sees. And he devised a material vocabulary for the photograph that is an extraordinary
well, I think it really has,
accomplishment.
And I think it has actually a lot of even more influence on your later work, because I think of your early work, and it's as being more prose in a sense. And I think you've crossed over into world of pure poetry, which is what I think is what happened with de Carava, and and that line between prose being more description and poetry being more metaphor. That's what I see with the most recent bodies of work. And
there's a few earlier photographs of mine. There's a photograph of de Carava. I think it's called The Graduate or Graduation, and it's a young black girl in a white dress moving out of the shadows into the light. And my Harlem USA photograph of the two boys walking into the shadows.
Yes.
I mean, de Carava taught me how to see light.
It's there from the beginning.
Yeah. Roy de Carava taught me how to see light. And then he also opened up the possibility of what the photograph could be as an expressive object through the manipulation of its materiality. Yeah. he is probably a singular early influence on my work.
So we have, in the last few minutes or so that we have, what I'd like to do is, we have, these wonderful examples of, in this here place, the current body of work, which also are portraits in absentia, in a way. I mean, there's no people, and we will see the snippet will end with a snippet of the video.
Remember, that's your definition, not mine.
Oh, we curators, we cheat a little, but
don't quote me.
I won't quote you.
I won't disown
you have witnesses. But this new body of work, there are no portraits per se in this. There are no people per se in this new body of work, and I thought maybe you'd say a word about this, and then I want to just talk briefly a little bit about the idea of the expanded space for installation in your works and how you think about that.
Yeah, again, this new work is about the narrative of space and place in relation to a particular aspect of African American history, which again is American history. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to make work about that place that was formative and the relationship between Africans who then became African Americans through the slave trade and being brought to these kinds of sites, the plantation sites. I wanted to make work about that as a way to, keep that history and those relationships in the current conversation, because there is a very straight line that can be drawn from the plantation to, for example, George Floyd. If you think about the formative, violent, inhuman relationship that was forged on the plantation.
Yep, it's a direct line.
It's a direct, straight line.
Absolutely.
Straight line. The plantation explains a lot.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to make that work for that reason, to bring these places back into the discussion, because these are the formative landscapes in which African Americans began their relationship with this country.
That's right.
And all of the tension that has taken place, all of the violence that has taken place in this country in relation to its Black citizens has to do with the disruption of the narrative that begins on the plantation, which some would still not like to have disrupted, but to be continued. Yeah. So to me,
you needed to go back to the point of origin in a way.
Yep, yeah. So I really wanted to spend some time thinking about that and making work about that, because these sites are so important to understanding where we are. They are the sites of the formation of this country's economy and of the global economy. The country as it now exists would not have existed without the enslaved labor that made this, that built this economy through sugar, cotton, and tobacco. It all begins here. Yep. And I just wanted to make some work that reminded people, like this is where it begins, and that we need to be mindful of that fact, because if you are, then certain things that are happening now really shouldn't surprise you.
Yeah, sadly. So Dawoud, I'm going to put us slightly in fast forward because I want to because I want to come back or come to in this place. Um, you know, you work most often in the white box with images on the wall. But and if we take a look at, for example, Night Coming Tenderly, and when you actually displayed photographs in one of the sites on the railroad. Can you talk about the idea of site-specific and the idea of expanded space for you?
This was a very interesting and unique opportunity that presented itself when I was commissioned to make work for the
Church?
for the triennial.
Oh, for the Cleveland Triennial.
For the Font Triennial.
Right.
In Cleveland. And this site was actually proposed to me by the curator of the Font Triennial that year, Michelle Grabner. Mm-hmm. And I initially kind of pushed back. I remember specifically telling her that I'm a white box artist that makes work about non-white box things, because that's the space in which my work.
Well, that's exactly my question.
Functions.
I mean, all of a sudden you're now.
Yeah, to kind of disrupt that space, to bring something else into that space. I had never worked with this degree of site specificity before.
And how was that? And is this a direction you think that is increasingly opening to you, or is this a one-off?
I'm always, it's not too far from my mind. This presented itself in a way that, really worked once I embraced it and figured out the presentation strategy, and then worked with the installation firm to figure out the engineering of suspending the photograph. So this worked absolutely. And I've thought about continuing, that idea again. And it probably will happen. I haven't yet found the right situation for that. In this here place, when it's presented in New Orleans as part of Prospect, it's going to be presented in the historic New Orleans collection space. So it's a space of history, of and about history. So again, there's that kind of relationship between the work and the site, but not in quite the same way as this place, which really physically just embodied and reeked of the history. The paint was peeling. It hadn't been gussied up. It was in a kind of mild disrepair that materially and architecturally spoke of its history. So that was a very unique opportunity, and I have to thank Michelle Grabner for nudging me in that direction, because it really worked out quite well once I embraced it and started to figure it out.
Because I would say even the Birmingham Project, as it's presented at the Whitney, and I realize this is a little bit of a collaboration with the wonderful curator Elizabeth. It has a very chapel-like quality because you have the photographs from the Birmingham, and then you have the video, and you walk in, and I saw people, the kind of hush the minute they went in, the dark walls, the video there, it became very much like a chapel-type setting, and
it is. It's an almost sanctuary.
Exactly.
Like space. And again, I can't take credit for that one either. That was Elizabeth Sherman who came up with the brilliant idea that this work could actually exist within the context of the larger survey exhibition in a separate space. It's clearly the only work in the exhibition that could function in this way, in this particular space. It's a kind of space of quietude that gives the work, I think, exactly what it needs for that level of quiet contemplation.
Yeah.
So again, I've been fortunate to work with some brilliant curators because they are open to having that kind of active conversation with the work.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning, and this is a good place to kind of end. I'm going to end with your video evergreen, but you talked about the relationship of the community to the museum to you, and that's a kind of conversation three ways.
Yeah. And I'm always open to that conversation because I know from experience that something very good and interesting can
come out
result.
of it.
Yeah, it can come out of that conversation.
And that's what I'm seeing in your portraits too. It's the conversation, the quiet conversation you're having with each one of your subjects. It's seeing the possibilities of what can come out of that, and that's
because I think with the portraits I try to make everything else around us momentarily disappear, and it's just this space here, me and you, and incidentally the camera. But I try to create a space of quietude within the everyday activity that actually is going on, but to make that momentarily disappear. And that's what gives the quality, the photographs, that quality of contemplation on the part of the subject that they do have.
This is a perfect place to do the final piece of this, and that is to show just a very, very brief snippet of your newest video, 3-channel video, Evergreen. So maybe we could just show that, and then...
There is peace in the valley for me. There is peace in the valley for me.
Extraordinary. I actually don't want any words to end to muddle with this, because you create in this 3-channel piece a kind of sacred space, and the collaboration with Imani Zuri, the choreographer, and your use of the expanded space to kind of bring you into that context is really breathtaking.
Thank you. Yes, she and I have worked on 2 other collaborations around the Night Coming Tenderly Black work. When I exhibited that work for the first time, at the Art Institute of Chicago. She did a performance in the gallery space of the museum to the work and then to the audience. Again, bringing a vocal and a sonic presence to the work that amplifies the things that the work is about. Because that's, all photographs are inherently mute. They are about things, they tell us something, but they are fundamentally mute objects. And I've been wanting to amplify this history work in different ways and give it something of a sonic presence. So she and I have been collaborating, and we'll probably find something else to work on. But her area of both research and performance, I mean, she does a lot of different kinds of music, but her area of research and performance is within those songs from African American history that spring from the antebellum and the plantation era experience. So I never thought that there was anyone else that I could ask to collaborate with on this work. And I just love what she brings to the work.
Well, thank you for speaking with us. Thank you for making the images speak in yet another way. And I just want to say, Dawoud, what a great honor it is to have your exhibition here at the Whitney Museum. It's a very important occasion and history making in its own way. And thank you and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.